So today I'll be talking about harnessing wearable device data for network analysis. And again, as Professor Moody already prefaced it, we don't do any network analysis. And so hopefully this talk will be an introduction to what kind of work we do, and hopefully we can collaborate on future research. And so I'm actually a fourth-year PhD candidate in Dr. Jesselyn Dunn's lab. Yes, I'm in the biomedical engineering department, and so a lot of our research is more focused in machine learning and deep learning. And so again, network analysis is something that I'm eager to learn and incorporate into our research. And so in terms of the agenda, I'll just briefly talk about wearable devices, how they're currently being used and how they're being adopted. And then the bulk of this presentation will actually just focus on research that I've been doing in our lab. And our lab is called Big Ideas Lab, and I'll explain what this acronym actually stands for. And then the last 2 points, I'll just briefly talk about ways that I think that wearable device data can be incorporated into network analysis, and what sort of caveats there are in terms of wearable device data collection. And so on the bottom, you'll see like a little, tracker to see where we are currently in the talk. And so hopefully that will help us know where we are at in terms of time. And so first, I'll just talk about the adoption of smart devices. And so Pew Research Study, they've been doing a lot of surveys over the past couple of years. And what we've been seeing is that there's been a growing adoption of smart devices. And so a lot more individuals obviously own cell phones. So 85% of Americans currently own smartphones. But also there are a lot of individuals who are purchasing smart watches. And so 31% of Americans have smart devices. And here, let me just turn on the laser pointer. On the right, you can see that it's broken down based on age group. And so again, we see with younger individuals, there's a greater adoption of these smart watches. Again, with older folks, it might not be as prevalent. But overall, it's 31% of the American population. And so there's a great opportunity for us to be able to collect a lot of continuous longitudinal data from this type of population. And so when we think about wearables, there's a lot of different devices that we can think of. I don't know if folks recall Google creating Google Glasses, but that didn't really pick up. And there are a lot of different research labs that have also been focused on creating devices such as smart clothing, different sensors within your socks or your shoes. And all these different devices can be used to study varying fields of research. And so you can see that in order to understand your cardiovascular health, there are all these different devices that you can add. And you can see that for all these different departments, there are all these devices that you can tack on. And so for our research lab and our primary source of data, we primarily just use wrist-worn wearable devices. And this comes in two different grades. And so there's your commercial grade commercial grade watches, so your Fitbit, Garmin, Apple watches. And then there are also research grade watches. So this is from Empatica E4, and this is a company that tries to detect epilepsy. And so they have a much higher sampling rate in terms of their photoplethysmography. So that's the optical sensor, the green light that you see on your wristwatch. And they're able to get a lot more data that is not as common in these commercial wearable devices. And so I'll just briefly go over all the available endpoints. And the endpoints that we primarily use are heart rate, which most folks know, activity, and this is usually reported in terms of step counts, sleep, and so people can probably see their different sleep stages on their watches. And then recently, a lot of these commercial grade watches have been incorporating a lot more, health-related endpoints. And so they've been including temperature deviation when you're asleep, and this has been contributing towards also infectious disease detection. They also are able to capture your breathing rates at night. And then both Garmin, Fitbit, and I think Apple Watch as well have these proxies for VO2 max. And so VO2 max for individuals in cardiovascular research, this is a great indicator. This is a good indicator for your risk for heart failure. And so we see the intersection of technology with health, again, in a lot of these commercial grade companies. And then also with the more recent devices, they've been advertising your electrocardiogram and being able to detect atrial fibrillations. And then there's also electrodermal activity. So this is skin conductance, but I would say that this endpoint isn't as reliable as we would want it to be. And so with all this data collection and with all this data that we're getting from a lot of these companies, there are obviously going to be some challenges. And so first, there's the issue of sensor accuracy and validation. And so a lot of these companies are going to be reporting values, but how well do they measure up to gold standard values? And so that's something that we as a research lab have published some papers on, and we want to make sure that the sensors that we're working with are collecting data accurately. The second issue is the black box approach. And so a lot of, again, these companies have proprietary algorithm and methods for coming up with these calculations, and we don't necessarily know how they're coming up with these values, and they won't necessarily let us know how they generated these values. And so we as researchers and engineers are trying to reverse engineer a lot of these problems back so that we can understand how they're coming up with this. The third point is kind of related to the proprietary technology, so interoperability and standards. Because all these companies don't necessarily work with one another, there's an issue of standard definitions and the data collection that they've been doing. And so one common problem is how folks are defining resting heart rate. And so some companies might just define it as a time outside of your sleep when you have no steps. Other companies might be defining it as the time that you're asleep. And so there are differing definitions and different ways of reporting these sort of metrics. And then data deluge, there's just a lot of data that you're going to be collecting from your wearable device data. You'll get like millions of rows of data because of the high sampling rates. And you're going to be looking at years of data for participants. And then fifth, security. So obviously, we want to collect this data in a safe manner. And while wearable device data isn't considered PII, one of our projects in our lab is seeing if we would be able to re-identify participants just based on the wearable device data. And so there's an issue of security. And then the last point, bias and inequities. This is something that I'll be touching more on during the remainder of this talk. But there is a bias in terms of how we're collecting the data and who this technology is available for. And so we want to make sure that any of the algorithms that we develop are accurately tested and trained on for the target population that we want to help provide some sort of intervention or some sort of detection model for. And so the Big Ideas Lab, we're not claiming that we have all the big ideas. It's actually just an acronym. And so we're the biomedical informatics group, and what we do is we integrate data engineering and analytics. And we know that that's a mouthful, but our overarching goal is just to develop and test tools and infrastructure using biomedical and health data for early detection, intervention, and prevention of diseases. And so those three points will be sort of main research areas that we focus on. One other term that I just want to briefly define before we continue is digital biomarker. And so this is a common term that's used in our digital health space, but it just refers to data that's been digitally collected. So your GPS, your location from your smartphone GPS data, that's referred to as a digital biomarker in our space. And it's just going to be used as an input in order to better indicate a future health outcome. And so in terms of what our lab sort of research focuses on, there's some folks, or my initial interest was actually in a lot of cardiometabolic disease detection. And so looking into the risk of heart failure, there's, looking into how prediabetes occurs prior to any sort of symptom development. And then some of my peers are working on a lot of research in the sleep space. So looking at circadian disruption, especially for night shift workers, and then how we can improve exercise and sleep. And then recently, in these past couple of years, I've been focused more on susceptibility of contracting illness and then sort of determining how we're able to detect illness prior to symptom onset. And so that's kind of the main focus of my personal research. And so just to go over, again, our lab research areas, first, we're just trying to discover, validate any sort of digital biomarkers that are related to illnesses. And so this is purely just physiological signals that we're getting from these sensors that are related to these illnesses. The second point is we want to predict if any sort of intervention strategies or therapies that we come up with will be successful for these individuals. And lastly, we want to develop a personalized just-in-time intervention using these mobile health technologies. And so I will say that for our lab, we've primarily focused on research areas 1 and 2. And I think in terms of network analysis and more interactions between populations, I think this area is an area that we can further explore. And so, now I'll be moving into the current research that I've been doing in our lab. And for the purpose of this talk, I tried to, I guess, group it into these sort of themes. And so the first theme is just understanding digital health study engagement. And so we want to understand demographic imbalances in our study population and how participants are filling out their surveys. And so we use, I guess, or I'll mention it later on. And then the second part of the current research that I'll go over is the physiological response detection. And so again, we were trying to figure out which individuals should we be providing diagnostic tests in the pandemic, especially if we were in a resource-limited setting. And so I'll move on into, I know I'm introducing a lot of different terminology, but one common study design practice in our field is the bring your own device study. And so this has been very popular amongst research groups, including our own, where researchers request participants to provide their digital health data. And this is very beneficial as, again, you're not limited by any sort of budget, and you're able to sample from any population that you want as long as you get your advertisement out. And so the ideal workflow would be that you have your study population that you want to target, you launch this sort of digital health study, and then you'll receive all this data that you use for analysis. But what we do see in a lot of these BYOD studies is that, oh, sorry for the text here. As the study goes on and as participants are filling out these different surveys, there's going to be a lot of participant loss. And so what we result in the resulting analysis population is a very non-representative population. And you may be wondering, why is this an issue? There are two primary issues. And so first, diseases don't necessarily manifest the same way across different demographics. And this is something that we've seen not in the wearable device space, but for coronary heart disease. And so women have different risk factors associated with coronary heart disease that wasn't known of until, I guess, fairly recently, because the initial research studies that were conducted were done on older white men. And so there's a need to make sure that we understand how these different diseases progress for different demographics. The second point is that devices and sensors don't necessarily work equally well across all different demographics. And so also during the pandemic, we saw that pulse oximeters, so the finger pulse that you get at the hospital, they weren't necessarily working as well for detecting occult hypoxia, so lower oxygen saturation in your blood, for individuals who had higher melanin content, so darker skin tones. And so this is a paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and this is a pretty hot topic since we do work with a lot of wearable devices and a lot of sensors. We do want to make sure that our sensors are working accurately, but if we don't know, or if we know that it doesn't work reliably for a specific group of individuals, then we should be readjusting how we're collecting data and how we're going to do our analysis. And so we actually published a sort of opinion piece on how these different BYOD studies are reporting their demographic distributions. And to say the least, a lot of these research groups don't necessarily report the different demographics as they should. And so what we see is that a lot of research groups mix race and ethnicity in their reporting, or sometimes don't even include these values. So you won't have a participant population that tallies up to 100%. And what you do primarily see in a lot of these BYOD studies is that the white population is heavily overrepresented. And so you see that there are usually underrepresentation for the Black and Hispanic population. One thing to note is that the All of Us, so the NIH All of Us study that has been going on for quite some time, they have been, and one thing that they have been doing well is that they've been able to recruit participants from historically underrepresented groups. But in terms of the wearable device space for All of Us, that's not necessarily the case. And so I don't have that the numbers over here, but the values for the demographic distribution for the All of Us like Fitbit data is closer to a lot of these BYOD studies. And so one paper that we're currently having in preparation is proposing a method to improve our participant engagement, especially in these BYOD studies. And so our proposal is that we need to understand our study adherence and how participants are engaging in these studies as we prepare for these longitudinal digital health studies or as we've collected this data. And so once we've done these study adherence analysis, we want to take proactive steps to maintain the participant adherence, so targeting specific groups that we know will drop out of the study. And we're doing this analysis through unsupervised clustering and through multi-state modeling. And so this might be statistical modeling that folks here might be more familiar with. And so to go over the data set that we were working with, this is data that we had collected from our study called COVE-Identify, and we launched this back in April 2020. And so this was at the peak of the pandemic, or at the start of the pandemic, and all the research groups, including ours, like Scripps and Stanford, wanted to collect a lot of wearable device data from just the American population in general. And so the bare minimum requirement for joining our study was that participants just needed to be 18 years of age or older and have access to the internet and own some sort of smartphone. And so we created this website where participants would go on, they would complete some enrollment survey. If they owned a Fitbit, Garmin, or Apple Watch, they would be able to donate that data, and then we would collect that data on Microsoft Azure using APIs, and then also get wearable device data from Apple Watches using an application that we had developed. And so the primary digital biomarkers that we were interested in were, again, the values that I had, or the endpoints that I had mentioned, your heart rate, activity, sleep, and then we were also asking participants to provide their symptom scores. And so we did have a lot of participants primarily coming from North Carolina, obviously, because we were advertising and Duke was publishing or putting out articles regarding our study. But we also did have some participation from across the US in California, Texas, New York, and Florida. And so for this analysis in terms of understanding how to better improve participant engagement, for this paper, we actually collaborated with Evidation Health. So this is a health tech company, and these are sort of the enrollment numbers that we had for this paper analysis. And so Evidation, at the same time that we were launching our COVE-Identify study, was doing this remote digital health study in order to understand participants' symptoms, their reported testing, and their population distribution was fairly similar to ours. So I guess for COVE-Identify, we had a more equal breakdown of male to female ratio. For Evidation Health, they had a much higher representation of female. For race, again, as we had seen in the previous stacked bar plot, the majority of the individuals were white. And then in terms of age group, as we had seen with the Pew Research study, there were a lot of individuals in the Evidation Health who were much younger. And for our distribution, we had a sort of equal spread across all the different age groups. And so to understand how participants were filling out their surveys, especially for reporting their symptoms, we kind of created this graphic. And so in order to understand this, so the blue refers to if an individual had filled out a survey for that day. The yellow, so inact, that refers to a survey was not filled out for that day. And the red, exit, refers to them having opted out of the study or them having just completely stopped filling out surveys after the end of the study duration. And so one thing to note, again, with this BYOD structure is that we weren't providing any sort of financial compensation. There was no incentive for people to be filling out these surveys on a regular basis. And so here we can see with this heat map sort of the spread of how participants were filling these surveys out. So each row is one participant, and then this is across all the different times. And so using unsupervised clustering, we were able to figure out the different cluster labels and see for Duke, so this is the COVE-Identify study, and for Evidation, what the different clusters look like. And so here you can kind of see for our COVE-Identify study, we also have this little gap. And this is, we think that this primarily attributed to the fact that we kind of adjusted our study design as the pandemic was going on. And so again, as I mentioned, we launched the study in April 2020, and we thought the pandemic would only last for a couple months. And so so we only had sent out surveys for a 3-month time period. and then we realized, oh, we need to send out these surveys on a daily basis. And so we had participants who had initially enrolled re-enroll in our study, but again, there was a sort of delay in the participants re-enrolling in these studies, and so that's sort of where we see this gap. But as you can see for the other clusters, so D2, D1, and D0, and then E2, E1, E0, you can see the similar trends of individuals filling out their initial enrollment survey, filling out surveys sporadically, but then largely just dropping out of the study, and then E1, participants who fill out a fair number of surveys, because this is 50 days, so people are filling out surveys for roughly a month, and then dropping out, and then we have individuals who are highly adherent to filling out these daily surveys. And so we also just, based on the clustering labels that we had, we can also see the different breakdown of the demographic factors in these different groups. And one thing that we can note here is, again, that the younger population was more prevalent in this D0 and E0 group, that there's a greater percentage of these individuals at that age group. And so we wanted to understand how these sort of different demographic factors affect how individuals are filling out the surveys. And the common literature at this point in time in our remote digital health studies is primarily just to use survival analysis. And so individuals would either define the event as when an individual dropped out of the study or when their first not filled survey is recorded. And so this is the survival analysis for if we consider the participant to have quit the study, and we were just looking at a time window of 30 days. And so here we see for our COVID-identify study that there is some difference with the white population with the Asian and Black population, but there wasn't any real significant difference for the evidation group. But across both evidation and COVID-identify in terms of age, we see that the older you are, that there's a higher chance of you staying in the study, while the younger you are, the lower your probability of staying in the study. And so we didn't see any sort of significant difference for the male and female population. But we didn't think that this was necessarily the best way of modeling participant survey filling out patterns, especially since there's a recurrent event occurring. So participants can always choose to not fill out a survey, say on day 30, but then they can choose to come back, quote unquote, into the study by filling out the survey on day 31. And so we thought a recurrent event analysis would work better, and so we did multi-state modeling. And so again, these are the possible transitions that can occur, and then these are the different transition intensities that we would be getting for this model. And so we saw the same trend in terms of age group, where again, the younger the population, the more likely they are to exit the study or be inactive in terms of filling out the surveys. And for the other different demographic factors, we didn't necessarily see major differences. And so this is fairly consistent with what we see in terms of the literature for a lot of remote digital health studies, in terms of how participants are engaging with these longitudinal large-scale studies. And so just going back to, again, the graphic of how we want to better target this target our study population in order to get a relatively representative population. From this analysis, we realized that we would want to target individuals who are younger, just because they are less likely to adhere to filling out surveys. And so in, again, our opinion piece, we sort of provided this sort of guideline in terms of identifying which populations are going to be omitted in the final analysis, making modifications in our study design, and then launching the study accordingly. And so this opinion piece was published very early in our study process. And so at the time that we were doing a lot of exploratory data analysis, what we had seen was that the Latin population and the Black population was severely underrepresented. And so at the time, we provided wearable devices and had more of a strategic approach in terms of advertising to the American Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and providing wearable devices to a lot of individuals to increase the enrollment of these historically underrepresented groups. And so what we saw was that we did get a much larger recruitment through these targeted interventions and through targeted presentations regarding our work. And so this during this time, we saw like a 200% increase in our study population, and this is roughly from like 300 individuals to 600 individuals. And so that's kind of it in terms of the digital health study engagement portion. And then I'll be moving on in terms of the physiological response detection. And so this is a paper that we published at the end of last year, so in September 2022, where again, we wanted to address the issue of diagnostic testing shortages during the COVID pandemic. And so one thing that we saw throughout the pandemic was that there were all these different variants that were occurring, and with each variant, there was a surge in the number of testing kits that were necessary. And so I think in July of 2021, we saw that there were initially only 150,000 testing kits necessary, but then that demand went up to 1.5 million at that time. And so how do we address this sort of testing shortage during this critical time period? And so what we came up with was intelligent testing allocation system. And so in this very contrived, very controlled setting, consider a population, so this is like 24 individuals, and you know that you don't know that there are 5 individuals who are COVID positive, but this is just, the orange is labeled for the COVID positive, and you only have 9 testing kits. So how would you allocate which individuals should be receiving these tests? And so just based on a random testing allocation, you would only get an 11% positivity rate. And so this would just be one individual that tests positive within 9 individuals. But using our wearable device data that we're collecting and using the physiological signals that we're collecting, if we ranked individuals based on how their signals are coming in, we would be able to identify which individuals should get tested, and you would have a positivity rate that is much higher. And so this is, again, in a very specific situation where you have participants providing the wearable device data, and you have a very limited number of tests. And so what we see in the data in terms of the individuals who did test positive for COVID, so this is with 50 participants, and this is the averaged out steps value for all 50 participants over this time period. And these individuals had reported their diagnostic test date, they had tested positive, and then we shifted everybody's test date to sort of day 0. And then looking retrospectively in time, we defined this window of time as the detection period. And so we know that COVID has an incubation of like 2 to 14 days. And so we would state, we don't necessarily know when this individual had their infection date, but we do know when their test date was. And so we know that within this time window, they must have contracted COVID. And then looking back before that detection period, we have the baseline period. And so this is to establish a sort of baseline understanding of this person's physiology. And we want to see if there are any sort of differences between this baseline period and this detection period window. And so we generated a lot of different features. And one of the features that we used was the differences in steps relative to their diagnostic test date. And so what we commonly saw in our study and in other studies that did similar work was that you would have a decrease in the number of steps prior to their diagnostic test time, and then you would have an elevated resting heart rate value. And so again, the steps is a little tricky to, or there are other factors that we should be considering. So if somebody knows that they're sick, they might have just been quarantining, or they might just be staying more at home because they wouldn't want others to get sick. And so there could be some confounding variables in terms of why an individual steps count went down during this time. But regardless of across all the different studies, we have seen that there is an increase in your elevated resting heart rate, or there's an elevated resting heart rate around the diagnostic test time. And so we ran some machine learning models on this, and we tested a bunch of different classification algorithms, and the one that performed the best was logistic regression, and we did just a 5-fold cross-validation. And what we saw was, for our training set, that the combined model worked the best. But again, because we have a lot more individuals who are COVID negative, this is a very imbalanced data set. And so we thought that precision recall made more sense in terms of how we understand this data. And then, again, in terms of understanding the positivity rate, so how many tests are available and how many individuals would test positive. You can see that just the red line would be the random testing allocation, but over time, you would see that, or with a very limited number of tests, you would be able to get a very high positivity rate. And so again, this is a very contrived example where you just have a limited number of tests to provide for individuals, but you've already generated a ranked list of which individuals should get tested based on this sort of modeling. And so for our test set, we just went with a model that contained both the steps and resting heart rate values, and our area under the curve receiving, AUC value was 0.7. But again, this isn't necessarily the best way of reporting this value because this is an imbalanced data set. And so with the precision recall curve, our AUC value isn't that great, again, because we have a large class imbalance. But this is the sort of method that our research lab has been trying to detect or differentiate the difference between COVID positive and COVID negative populations using our wearable device data. And so moving on in terms of the intersection of wearable devices and network models, there were some examples that had occurred during the pandemic, especially in terms of proximity detection. And so I don't know if folks recall that when NBA was in their NBA bubble ring, they provided Oura rings to everyone, and they would have a proximity detection. So if somebody had contracted COVID, the Bluetooth signal would let them know that somebody near them had COVID. And this was another model that was incorporated at some other university. But again, there was a large uproar in terms of what data we're collecting and how we're alerting individuals. One other way that the wearable device data is used in network analysis is improving health interventions. And so for folks who do own Fitbit, Garmin, and Apple Watches, there are a lot of friend network features in order to track how you're moving. And Apple has their close the rings, and so you can compete against one another. And there are different ways that you can sort of see health interventions be incorporated, especially within these networks of friends. And so in terms of potential projects, we'll be extending our COVID-19 study. So we'll be pulling participants from the Duke EHR who have a recorded diagnostic test for various influenza-like illnesses. And then we're potentially thinking about incorporating the Durham County Social Determinants of Health database since we know where these individuals are residing. And so this can be a way for us to overlay both the wearable device data with the different diagnostic test times because we're looking at a 5-year time frame. And then we also have county information, so where these individuals are present. And then, as I mentioned before, we can potentially improve health outcomes based on these different network models that are provided within these wearable devices. And then one other aspect that I would hope that we can learn for network analysis is a better study design for recruitment. And so our initial method for recruiting participants for COVID-19 was just using Facebook advertisement management or just word of mouth. But if there is a better strategy for us to be able to recruit at a larger scale, then that would help our data set be more representative and better for our analysis. And so in terms of final remarks or sort of issues that we currently have with wearable devices, one other aspect is varying levels of missingness. And so I don't know about folks here, but I know a lot of people who don't wear their Apple Watches at nighttime or don't wear their watches because of charging it, so battery life, or because it's uncomfortable at night, or there's various reasons for lower levels of watch adherence. But this does affect how we do our analysis because we do threshold how much data we have, and then we remove participants who don't have sufficient data in our analysis. And then as I've mentioned before, in terms of the sensor accuracy and validity, and then lack of standard across different companies, this is something that we have to continually address as companies come out with new endpoints, and we're not too sure how they're actually coming up with these calculations. And then one other issue that we have within our wearable device space is a lot of people's concerns regarding re-identification. And so there is a high level of, not skepticism, but high level of concern for individuals providing their wearable device data because they don't want to be re-identified or don't want to contribute that much data for research, or they don't know how this data is going to be incorporated. And then the last 2 points, so in terms of our research, it is very uncommon to pull location data, even though that is available within all these commercial wearable devices APIs and friend data. So those are two data sources that our lab hasn't primarily looked into, and a lot of other labs that do work in this wearable device space hasn't necessarily looked into. So this is a Wild West in terms of like IRB approval and how the School of Medicine will respond to this sort of data pool. So yeah, that's it. I would just like to thank my professor, Dr. Jesselyn Dunn, and then all of my lab members. And so yeah, thank you.
Really appreciate it. Questions or thoughts on wearable-related devices?
So as a mentioned networks, have you considered in your survey when you're entering the study asking, do you on your Apple Watch, do you compete with other people, and who do you compete with? Because that would give you an ego network immediately. And then you could also use that ego network for recruitment in your study.
Yeah, we have not considered it. So I think that could be a question that we would ask. And I think what we would appreciate, or what we would want to learn is actually how to phrase these sort of questions, because it is in an area that we're not too sure of. And so, but yeah, I think that would be a great idea in terms of the data that we're able to collect from participants.
I think there's something like a lot of ability to be able to see how, I guess in a work setting, right? How close you are to your boss, if you're having a meeting, right, and you're able to detect that, and then if that has a longitudinal effect on heart rate or stress levels or some sort of things that can be captured versus whether you're with colleagues and just kind of commiserating, and maybe if that helps reduce stress, and I don't know, it's just very interesting.
Yeah.
So how much have you guys explored using federated learning approaches to deal with the privacy?
Sorry, what?
How much have you guys explored using federated learning approaches to deal with the privacy issues here?
I'm not.
Is that something you guys have thought about?
Federated?
Federated learning.
I'm not too sure. Sorry.
Yeah, so this is it's one of these things. Ask your advisors probably.
Okay.
But the basic idea, right, is that you have a situation. Well, it has a lot of motivations, but your case would be a prime one. You got a situation where you want to do an analysis that involves a whole bunch of people and they all have data. They don't want to give it to you. So instead of having them all donate their data, and then you go and you do the analysis, but now you have all their data, you instead have a situation where you have a learning process that farms out the analysis to the clients, and the clients are only looking back certain pieces of results. So you never have their data. And there are ways to do it so that you can provably not reconstruct their data beyond whatever level of precision, and that's a big area right now. But I think for things like this where it's really sensitive and you're trying to figure out population stuff, the federated approach has a lot to say for it. So I was wondering how many people in that space were thinking about federated learning.
Yeah, I think that's an area of exploration. I will say that for our research, we do try to focus more on personalized methods, I guess, because we're getting physiological signals for an individual, and that we would want to see if there's any anomalies for that individual. But I think, yeah, going into the more population-based analysis, I think.
But you're probably still training a model somewhere.
Yeah. So.
To do that, and that model, you still have the issue that even if I'm going to make individual diagnosis, if I'm going to train that model by using other people's data, you still have this bullying problem. So anyway, it's just something that I think about, because in theory, at least, that may be a way to improve participation. Now, whether we believe you is another question, but at least if people, if you can say, I can guarantee that there is no way, the data doesn't leave your device, and no one's going to see it, I won't see it, and there's no way that we can recover things about your information. And there's the issue of getting them on board, but you talk about the IRB.
Yeah, no.
That's also the way to get the IRB
on board. Yeah.
Say, it's provably impossible for us to do this, and we never get their data. If you can get that level of review down, right, that obviously is huge gains for you.
Yeah. So, I will say that, for example, location data in terms of proximity is something that, IRB usually doesn't like, because again, we would be getting their location information, or a lot of participants would also not want to provide that data in terms of knowing where they are located.
And that's something that one can do. We can do stuff on that, not with all stuff.
Yeah.
just following up on that, so is the reason that people haven't used friend and location data because they don't want the data, or they're afraid to ask for it for either compliance or IRB?
I would say it's usually the latter, and then again, within this space, people haven't necessarily looked into using networks for doing their analysis. And so it's primarily just a lot of these, like we just recruited these individuals, we're getting all these different signals for that individual, and let's just treat them as a homogeneous group, and then see what we can see in terms of like how their signals are changing over some time. So.
And is it, I mean, there's a long history in network research of researchers being afraid to ask questions because they think that people will not answer them. And it turns out if you ask them, they're happy to answer them. And so I'm just curious, I'm just trying to figure out how much of this is self-censoring. Like maybe the IRB would be fine with it if we talk to them often enough. But I'm just, so I guess my encouragement would be, it'd be great for this group to like cross paths so that we can work together.
That'd be
We were having, I know that for me, I wear my Apple Watch so that I can feed my family and my exercise. I feel like if you use the network data that you get from like your competing group, you can almost, there would be less dropout, right? Because
their
families
accountability.
Gonna want it, everybody that you compete with is gonna do this thing, and like, hey, did you do your thing today?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if that's actually the case, but that could be a potential solution to your dropout problem.
And I think that hits the nail on the head. I think that's like what because I think in terms of especially the intervention strategies, as an engineering group, we don't necessarily know what the best intervention methods are. And even when we work with like the Duke CTSI and like different recruitment innovation groups, they didn't have a set strategy for how we should approach this sort of dropout problem in a lot of these surveys, for a lot of these surveys. And so, I think that might be a good path to sort of look into.
Just as a minor asterisk, one of the best causally identified papers for peer influence on health did use a competition network like this. I don't know if it was Fitbit or one of the others, on the friending set for exercise time. And the beauty of the model was because your friends weren't necessarily local, you could actually use instruments of the weather. And so this is Sinan Aral's work on, essentially, do my peers make me exercise more? And it turns out that it's a very strong peer effect on exercise. So it's a brilliant paper. It came out in European Answer Science, but Sinan Aral is the author of that. If you're interested. All right, please, Carter, more.
One last question is, but following up on these recruitment issues. So, I mean, here's a counterpoint question. Okay, you can use the methods that you use, either going to targeted community organizations to get people in population, or using things like people who commit, people who compete aggressively at fitness to get people. And that obviously has some positives in terms of you get certain populations, you're able to retain people. But that also biases your sample, right, in a really aggressive way that is directly related to health adherence, right? Because the behavior of people who are, for instance, regular churchgoers is not the same as the behavior of people. The behavior of people who are aggressively competing with their family, with their Apple Watch for exercise is not like everyone else. And so you substituted one potential recruitment bias with a different bias. The other bias is hypothetically health related. The bias you now have is definitely health related. So the counterpoint argument is maybe you just made everything worse. So how are you controlling? It's in theory you can control for anything with the right data, but so how are you controlling or estimating those recruitment biases, and when do you determine whether you would have been better off with a smaller N that wasn't as distorted, in these hidden variables versus I got more people for longer, but those people are very different from the broader population.
Yeah, I think that addresses a great point. So I think I briefly mentioned it with our future study that we're going to be launching very soon. But so one is that in terms of our recruitment, it's no longer a longitudinal study. So we'll basically just be, because we already have individuals who have tested positive or negative for these different influenza-like illnesses, And then we're just sending them a one-time email to sort of ask them to donate wearable device data if they own that data. And so because, again, it's very selective to the individuals who have a test result in the EHR system, but we would be able to get their wearable device data retrospectively and then do analysis just based on that one-time survey that's been done. So it takes out the longitudinal aspect that we've seen in terms of the attrition, in terms of participation, and we're banking on the idea that this is the most severe sort of cases that we would be seeing in the hospital. And so if there are stronger physiological signals that we can detect using these wearable devices, then we know that there's some merit in using wearable devices for detection. I think the harder part for addressing like a very heterogeneous population where maybe somebody is asymptomatic, but they are testing positive for COVID is that, again, we don't know if their physiological responses will showcase signals that we will be picking up. And it's harder to sort of differentiate somebody who's very asymptomatic versus not asymptomatic just based on their diagnostic test results. Does that make sense?
Well, you didn't answer my question,
Oh.
but anyway.
All right, thank you very much,
Yeah.
Peter, we really appreciate it.